Okay. So your exam, again, chapters 1, 2, and 3, I believe it is where you can take it up until Friday at 11:59. Yes, ma'am? JC, thank you. All right, I'll get that fixed. So I'm gonna. Okay. But yeah, you have until Friday at 11:59 to go ahead and get that done. We finished chapter 3 on Tuesday. Remember to go over the review sheet. Tells you what topics to go over. Also gives you ideas on types of questions, like what kinds of words will show up as matching types of questions. What types of questions could show up as essay questions. So we're giving those to you. And again, practice those. Type them out on a computer because you're going to have to type them out. You can't use them, but just get used to typing your answers. You've got let's go ahead and go back to the modules. So for week 1, you have the essay grading rubric. So again, just completion. If it's a complete answer, doesn't have to be real long. It just has to have the information that answers the question. Just a few sentences. Comprehension, for you indicating you have a deep understanding of material. Organization, if it's really organized, easy to follow. Logical, and no grammar or spelling options or errors. So you do that, you get 20 points, okay? I don't know about you, but I would like an extra 20 points on my test. So do what you got to do to get that. So I don't want to see any blank essays when I grade them. Because a blank essay is 0, okay? You know something about every question. I mean, we're giving you the questions, okay? I can't tell you which question you're going to get, but we're giving you all the questions, okay? So just make sure you know something about every essay question, okay? So that you can at least get most of those 20 points. Some people get all 20 points. So it's not just like, well, just the top student got 20. I usually have several students who get 20. And I have several students who get between 15 and 20 points. So don't throw away those points, okay? All right. Now for week 4, we're in the middle of week 4. So we got a pre-test you can take. It's not great, it's just for you. It's in the study area. We have the review sheet for exam 2. I'm not gonna really go over that much today just because you're still sort of probably in that mode of I've got to study for exam 1, so I don't want to go too much over that. We can go over that next week. You have notes, tissue types video, full notes. You have a handout that basically you can print out and bring to class and fill in the blanks on the notes, lecture presentation. You have some subcategories of connective tissue, some images there, YouTube playlists for you to watch, links to e-text. Make sure you're going into the study area of Mastering ANP and reading the e-text. I know you don't have a physical book, but you need to read it. Okay, you have an MP3 to listen to on epithelial tissue. If you want to study the different tissues, you can go to Practice Anatomy Lab in Mastering. It's very helpful. You have some flashcards, practice tests. You got several games you can play to help learn the different tissues. Okay, here's again a link to the exam 1 review sheet. You also have organ systems associated with the 3 germ layers. So that is something that you can be tested on. It's not specifically in chapter 4, but it relates to chapter 4. Okay. So this image comes from, I believe, chapter 29. So essentially, you know, we're not going to go over this in great detail today, but basically there's 3 germ layers from which all of your tissues arise from. And there's ectoderm, mesoderm, endoderm. You need to know generally which organ systems arise from which germ layer. Okay, now you'll see some organ systems that are in multiple, have multiple germ layers that they derive from. In those cases, you need to know a little something about the specific organs. Okay. For your quiz, you probably really just need to know organ systems and associated with each germ layer. For the exam, you would need to know more about the organs. Okay. So just learn a little bit about it for the quiz over chapter 4, then learn a little bit about the organs for your exam. Okay. So just wanted you to know that that's there and where to find it. All right, so let's go ahead and get into chapter 4. So we just covered cellular level organization, right? So let's go over tissue level organization. All right, so what we just talked about is a good segue into talking about origin of the tissues. So leading to the formation of your 3 primary germ layers. So you get a zygote when an egg fuses with sperm cell. That zygote's going to divide, form a solid ball of cells that we call a morula. And that morula will go into the uterine cavity, into the uterus. And inside the morula, a fluid-filled space starts developing, and we call that a blastocyst. And then you start seeing 2 specific kinds of cells. The trophoblast cells, they form the outer wall, eventually are going to become the fetal portion of your placenta, right, associated with the fetus. And you also have an inner cell mass, which is made up of embryonic cells, which again, as the name suggests, they give rise to your embryo. So when this happens, your morula is known as a blastocyst. Okay? I know it's a lot of terms going at you right away. Don't get overwhelmed with it. All right, the blastocyst then gets implanted on the wall of the uterus. Okay, then you start getting an amniotic cavity, which is a slit-like space. And it's going to form between the trophoblast and the inner cell mass. And that inner cell mass is going to have 2 layers. You have an upper layer, which is the ectoderm, close to the amniotic cavity. You have a lower level or layer called the endoderm. And it's going to be connected or close to the blastocyst cavity or blastocele. Now we start getting a 3rd layer in between the endoderm and ectoderm. That's called the mesoderm. And those are your 3 germ layers: endoderm, mesoderm, ectoderm. All your cells and tissues in your body are going to come from these 3 different layers. It tells you your study the chart. Again, because you have an e-text, page numbers don't matter. But study that chart that's in the week 4 module. And you got to know the derivatives of those germ layers. Okay? All right, so on to more adult tissues, all right? We've talked about development. Now let's go into more what your body exists as an adult. So what are tissues? Well, again, remember, tissues are when cells come together to perform a certain number of functions. In histology, remember, ology is study of, histo is tissue, so histology is study of tissues. So 4 tissue types. We'll cover this in lab a little bit today, as well as next week. So you have epithelial tissue, connective tissue, muscle tissue, and nervous or neural tissue. So the epithelial tissue, you'll see it on exposed surfaces. You'll see it lining passageways and chambers inside your body, also forming glands. In connective tissue, you'll see it in internal spaces. You'll see it supporting other tissues, transporting materials in your body. It also stores energy. Your muscle tissue does what muscle does. It contracts, right? Performs movements. Also generates heat. Your neural tissues carry signals from one part of your body to another part of the body. And that happens through electrical impulses. Okay? So that's kind of the overview of the chapter. It gets more specific as we go, but just really make sure you kind of understand that piece. Okay? So before we go further, I do think I will go a little bit over the study sheet, review sheet for chapter 4, just because before we get too more into details, I want you to see potential test questions. So I do think I'll go over it after all. All right. So exam 2 review sheets. So just focusing on chapter 4, like I said, derivatives of the germ layers. You'll be able to define some terms related to tissues and histology, secretions, characteristics of the different types of tissues, characteristics of different types of cell junctions. You need to know how to complete the sentence. Divisions by stem cells continually do what? You need to be able to know what that is. All right, so you got more information on glands and secretions. Types of epithelium, know their characteristics. You need to be able to finish the sentence, connective tissues create the blank. You know characteristics of connective tissue subcategories. All right, here's a short answer essay question. Again, would not show up on a quiz. It would show up on an exam potentially. Characteristics, steps, parts involved in inflammation or the inflammatory response. Matching that you could see on exam, not on a quiz, would be these terms. Okay, so a lot of this chapter we're going to cover in lab, but I just wanted you to see what potential questions might be before we get too far down the road here. All right. So let's take a break. And what I want you to do, let's see. All right. So, all right. So let's take a break here, and I will have you explain the 4 types of tissues to one another. And if you're playing along at home, you can do this as well. All right, let's start with epithelial tissue. So for epithelial tissue, glands and epithelia, right? It's what the name suggests. So what is epithelium? It's just layer cells. It's going to make a barrier, and that barrier is going to have certain properties. It can do things like cover surfaces, line tracts of your body, like your urinary tracts, reproductive tracts, digestive and respiratory tracts. Characteristics of epithelia, okay? And again, anytime you see the underlying words, those are words you need to know. So you could be asked, explain 3 characteristics of epithelia. You'd have to provide the word and the definition, okay? So cellularity means it has closely bound cells. Polarity means there's an uneven distribution of the components of the cytoplasm. You have 2 surfaces. You have an apical surface, and that's the exposed surface. That's either facing the outside of your body, or it's facing maybe the inside of your respiratory tract, digestive tract, something like that. Then you have a basal surface, which is basically the attachment point to the tissue underneath. Attachment's another characteristic. So the basal surface is going to be connected to a layer underneath called a basement membrane. Okay, so definitely you know about the basement membrane. So I know we don't have a lot of those in Texas, but you know, in houses where they have floors underneath the ground, it's the basement, lower level. All right. Complex structure, the basement membrane is, and it's made by the basal surface of your epithelium and the connective tissue underneath. Also, the epithelium is avascular, no blood vessels. And it can regenerate. Because you have lots of cells that get lost or damaged, and you need to be able to way to make new cells. So those are the characteristics. What are the functions of epithelial tissue? All right, another set that you would probably need to be able to provide, you know, the information on. All right, so they can protect you from things going on that are, you know, basically addressing the surface, so abrasion, chemicals, biological agents, dehydration. It can control permeability. It can control substances that enter or leave their body through epithelium. Sensation. So your epithelia is usually going to have a lot of nerves that connect to it. So you can detect changes in the environment and send that information to your nervous system. So if you touch a hot stove or a hot plate or something like that, if you have nerves in your skin, they basically are able to send signals to your brain and tell your brain that it's hot and to move your hand. All right, you can also produce secretions. So again, we said epithelial tissue is composed of epithelia and glands. So the gland cells make the secretions. These secretions can be exocrine or endocrine. And so if they are released onto the surface of the epithelium, it's considered an exocrine gland because it goes out to the surface. So sweat is exocrine, milk is exocrine. Endocrine secretions are released into the blood or surrounding interstitial fluid. So that's what your hormones are. Those are endocrine hormones, endocrine secretions. So like your pituitary, your thyroid gland, those are endocrine secreting glands. Okay, specializations in your epithelial cells. So what do they specialize for? Making secretions, we just talked about that. Moving fluids over the surface of the epithelium. And moving fluids through the epithelium. Okay, in some cases, you're actually moving through. All right, so like in the case of your digestive tract, your cells have to be able to withstand, you know, force of food moving past it, but they also have to be able to absorb that food, right? So those are some of the specializations. So epithelial cells can have polarity to them. We talked about that, having the two surfaces. Many epithelial cells have microvilli, very important in your small intestine, increasing absorption, increasing surface area. Some epithelial cells have what we call stereocilia. These are like microvilli, but they're extremely long relative, compared to microvilli which are short, and they don't really move. Okay. All right. Now, coordinated beating of the cilia for ciliated epithelium moves materials across your epithelial surface, like in your respiratory tract. So you want to be able to move mucus, which traps invaders. You want to be able to move it away from your epithelium. All right. So how do you maintain the epithelium integrity? So another way of describing that is, how does the epithelia stay together? Like, how does it not get damaged? So 3 factors affect that. Intercellular connections, so that just means connections inside the cells. The attachment of those cells to their basement membrane. All right, if they're not attached well, they can fall apart. And maintenance and repair of the epithelial tissue. So if you have good maintenance and repair, epithelium is going to have strong integrity. And here, when we're talking about integrity, we're talking about the ability to stay whole. And if you don't have good processes, it'll come apart. So specifically on the intercellular connections, your epithelial cells are going to be attached to one another. They have connections to each other. And as a unit, they get attached to fibers in the basement membrane. Okay, so epithelial cells are connected to each other and to the basement membrane. And the intercellular connections are concentrated at certain attachment sites, and the cell membranes will join or connect to one another. Okay, more terms. Your cell adhesion molecules, or CAMs. As the name suggests, they're molecules that help cells adhere. And they're transmembrane proteins, which means they're proteins that go across the membrane and will bind to one another as well as things outside the cell, and they adhere two cells together. Or they can adhere to the basement membrane. You also have intercellular cement, and these are proteoglycans, which again, remember, glycan is a type of sugar. Proteo means it's sugar with some protein on it, and it binds to cell membranes that are next to each other. It's like cement, it makes things more rigid and forms a firm surface. So like if cement's wet, you put something in it, when the cement dries, you're not going to be able to get it out, right? Okay, cell junctions. Fancy term just means specialized attachment sites. Okay, there's 3 different types of cell junctions or attachment sites. You have the tight junctions. And here with the tight junctions, you actually get some fusion of the phospholipid bilayers of the 2 membranes. And as the name suggests, the connection is tight, so there's little, if any, communication between the 2 cells. They're just tightly connected to each other. You have desmosomes, and they have those cell adhesion molecules and proteoglycans, okay, linking the 2 cells together. They're strong. Okay, prevent stretching and twisting of the cells, or if those things happen, the cells still stay together. Then you have gap junctions. It should say junctions and not functions. All right. And again, these have interlocking proteins called connexons. And the connexons hold the cells together. And the connexons are basically like a tube that extends from one cell to the next cell. And then material can flow through the connexon, the tube. All right, so we talked about the epithelium. Let's talk about the basement membrane. So the basement membrane essentially has two parts. You have a basal lamina and a reticular lamina. So the basal lamina is a layer that's closer to the epithelium. You have glycoproteins there, so mostly protein, some sugar, network of protein filaments. Underneath it's the deeper layer, which is reticular, has coarse protein fibers in it, which provides a lot of strength. Okay. So essentially, epithelium, basal lamina, reticular lamina. Okay. And that's on that inner surface, the basal surface. All right, so how do you maintain and repair the epithelium? Well, we learned about it in the last chapter through mitosis and cell cycle. And so cellular division through what we call germinative cells or stem cells. Okay, and those will replace the epithelial cells. Okay, epithelial cells are not really designed to last forever. Okay, they're designed to be created, destroyed, remade. Okay, so we talked about characteristics and functions of epithelia. Let's talk about how we classify those cells. So how we classify them based on how many cell layers there are and the shape of those cells on the exposed surface, on the apical surface. Okay, not the cells below, but the cells on the exposed surface. All right, so you're going to need to know description, location, functions, examples of different epithelium. Okay, so this is where we get into a lot of the specific ones. Okay, so if we're looking at layers of cells, you have simple epithelium, basement membrane, has single layer. Single layer of cells that cover that basement membrane. Whereas stratified epithelium is going to have multiple layers. Okay, a lot of stuff there, but basically that's really what you need to know as far as the difference. Simple is one layer, stratified is multiple layers. Now, if we talk about by shape, shape could be squamous, which means the cells are thin and flat. So depending on how you look at them, you could just see a small, thin cell, or if you look at it from a different angle, it could look like a fried egg, very irregular shape. It could be simple, or they can be stratified if there's multiple layers. Simple, if it's one layer, stratified is multiple layers. And, you know, I'm probably going to give you overview in here because we're going to go over this in lots of detail in lab. So you don't want to, I think it's easier when you look at the pictures. All right, so in simple squamous epithelium, I want you to know about the mesothelium and the endothelium. So simple squamous epithelium lines your ventral body cavities. Remember, ventral is toward the front of the body. Endothelium. Remember, ventral body cavities, things like your abdominal pelvic cavity, thoracic cavity. Endothelium, simple squamous epithelium, it lines your heart and your blood vessels. All right, so cuboidal epithelium, The shape of the cells is cuboidal, and it's cuboidal epithelium. Could be simple if it's one layer. See that in the kidney tubules. Stratified cuboidal if there are multiple layers. Okay, it's rare. You see them in the sweat glands. All right, another type of cuboidal epithelium is transitional epithelium. You'll see that in the urinary bladder, and it's good for stretching. Why does it need to stretch? Because sometimes your bladder's empty and sometimes it's full. Okay, and the cells adjust. And you'll see that in lab. All right, columnar epithelium. So the cells are going to be hexagonal in cross section if you look at it in cross section, but if you look at another angle, which is what you're more likely to see in lab, they just look like rectangles. Okay, tall and slender. And they can be simple cuboidal. Okay, involved with absorption and secretion if there's one layer. Could be pseudostratified if you have all cells touching the basement membrane, but some don't get to the apical surface. And you'll see that in nasal cavity, tracheae, bronchi, male reproductive tract. So medical application. So if you're studying cells that are collected from epithelial surfaces, it's called exfoliative cytology. Remember, cyto, study of cells. Exfoliative, so I don't know if any of you use, materials, skincare things, talking about exfoliation. So it's, getting certain cells off, right? So things like the pap smear, amniocentesis are also examples of exfoliative cytology. Okay, we talked about more of the traditional epithelia. Let's talk about the glands. Again, we mentioned the endocrine and exocrine glands. So again, the endocrine glands have secretions or hormones into the interstitial fluid. Exocrine glands discharge secretions onto the surface of the body, or they can just discharge secretions into ducts. So like you have sweat gland ducts, you have salivary gland ducts, tear ducts. Okay, now how do these secretions occur? Well, they can be merocrine, apocrine, or holocrine. So if they're merocrine, this is most common. Release method is exocytosis. So perspiration on your skin is an example of merocrine secretion. So one type of merocrine secretion is mucus, which is a merocrine secretion combining with water. So you might think of mucus as just mucus, but it's effective as a lubricant. Okay, it moistens, provides some protection because it can trap things in it. All right, trap foreign particles and microorganisms. All right, secretions can be apocrine. If you lose both the secretory product and some cytoplasm. So the perspiration on your body is mostly merocrine, but under your arms, it's apocrine. So, and also milk production. You have some apocrine and some merocrine secretion. Now, what about holocrine secretion? Well, this actually is a secretion that destroys the cell that's doing the secreting. And that cell gets packed so much with these secretions, it bursts. Example would be the sebaceous glands near your hair follicles. Okay. Okay. And we're going to take a break in just a second. So I know there's a lot of terms we just threw at you. All right. Types of secretions. You can also break them down into saying whether they're serous, mucous, or mixed endocrine. If they're serous, it means that there's some water involved. If they're mucus, it means that there's mucus involved and they secrete mucins that form mucus. If they're mixed, there's some combination of the two, okay? All right, so we're almost through with epithelia. All right, gland structure. Okay, if you have individual cells, they're unicellular. If you have glandular epithelium and other gland cells, you get multicellular glands. Special type of endocrine or exocrine unicellular gland is a goblet cell, secretes mucus or mucins, and it's exocrine. All right. Also, you can get what's called a secretory sheet. And these are basically cells that line organs like your stomach. It's multicellular and exocrine. Okay, but you want a layer because you have so much acid in your stomach, you want that layer of secreting cells. Okay, protect your cells. All right, characteristics of these multicellular exocrine glands. So if you characterize them by the shape of the gland, if they form tubes, then they're tubular. If they have pockets, they are considered alveolar or acinar. All right, if they have combination, they're tubulo-alveolar or tubulo-acinar. Also, you can look at whether they branch or not. If there's no branches, it's simple. If the gland has branches, it is compound. And then the relationship between the ducts and the glandular areas. If you have a common duct that connects several secretory areas, then that's branched. And we'll see this in lab. You'll see a picture that'll make this make a whole lot more sense. But we're just introducing the terms. Okay. So that's epithelial tissue. So let's take a minute. So first thing I want you to do, we'll go back. Let's talk about characteristics and functions of epithelial tissue. Okay, so that's what I want you to work on now. Okay, so let's start going over connective tissues. And again, we're going to kind of hit highlights because a lot of this we will go over in lab. All right, so 3 basic components of connective tissues. They're specialized, they have protein fibers, they have ground substance. It's a type of fluid. The matrix is a combination of your ground substance and the extracellular fibers around it. And it's the largest component you have in your connective tissue. Okay, so what are your functions of connective tissues? Structural framework in your body, can transport things, can protect your organs, support surround and connect tissues, can store energy, and can defend your body from different microorganisms. Okay, big categories in terms of how we classify connective tissue could be connective tissue proper, fluid, or supporting. Okay, and so we'll fit all the different ones into that. All right, so in connective tissue proper, again, basically you have loose connective tissue and dense connective tissue. In the fluid connective tissues, again, there's fluid, it could be blood or it could be lymph. Supporting connective tissues, basically, what you really, I think, need to know here is that cartilage and bone. Okay, those are your types of supportive connective tissue. So in terms of cells that you can see in connective tissue, one would be a fibroblast. So it's what you'll see most often. And they secrete a sugar called hyaluronin, as well as some proteins. Okay, and hyaluronin helps to give the ground substance its thickness. It makes it more viscous. You're also going to see macrophages. All right, and they engulf pathogens or damaged cells. And they can activate your immune system. And if they're fixed, that means they spend time in just a specific tissue most of the time. If they're free, they just kind of roam around, okay? You'll also see adipocytes. These are fat cells. You see mesenchymal cells. These are stem cells, okay? These are your basically connective tissue stem cells. And you'll see them most often when there's an injury or an infection because you need to make new cells. You also have melanocytes, make melanin, which is a brown pigment, give everyone's skin color, right? Everybody has some amount of melanin unless you're albino, just depending on your ethnicity, your genetics, or your health can determine how much melanin you make. All right, mast cells. These are near blood vessels. These get released after infection, help with inflammation, which we'll talk about later. Macrophages, these are things like neutrophils and eosinophils. These are blood cells that are phagocytes, so they can also eat things. So those are your main cell types. You also have fibers in your connective tissue. Most ones you'll see are collagen fibers, reticular fibers, and elastic fibers. And they are made by the fibroblast. Okay, we learned about those cells a minute ago. Okay, with your collagen fibers, these are the most common ones you'll see. Help you make up your tendons and your ligaments. Big thing I want you to know about those is tendons connect muscle, skeletal muscle to bone. Ligaments connect bone to bone. Okay? So if you're, in athletics, you got to make sure that your tendons are strong so that you protect your muscles, right? Keep those attachment points to the muscles good. You also need to make sure your ligaments are in good shape, because if you don't, then your joints will go bad. Okay, so you need to make sure you take care of your tendons and your ligaments. So those of you who are in athletics, so are those things that your coaches harp on? Do they harp on making sure you take care of your joints, take care of your muscles, right? I would hope so. Okay. So reticular fibers, another class of fiber, thinner than the collagen fibers. They form a framework called the stroma. And the function of the stroma is stabilize what we call the parenchyma. I know it's two terms there, but the parenchyma are your functional cells in your connective tissue. We just collectively call that parenchyma. They can stabilize blood vessels, nerves, and other structures. Most of the time, we'll see this in lab, but most of the time the reticular fibers are stained black. So that's how you'll be able to tell them apart from collagen fibers. You also have elastic fibers, and as the name suggests, they provide a little bit of stretchiness. Okay, and they can go back to their original length after being stretched. And it's because they have a protein called elastin. We talked a little bit about the ground substance before. So it fills the space between the cells, surrounds connective tissue. So it's clear, thick, or viscous, no color, much like syrup, keeps pathogens from spreading through your tissue. Okay, medical application, Marfan syndrome. I don't know if you've ever heard of Marfan syndrome or knew anybody that had it. So it's genetic, it's inherited. Individuals get very tall, they have long arms, legs, fingers. Okay, but it again has to do with connective tissue. All right. I know I can't remember the guy's name, but there's a basketball player who played for Baylor a few years ago, and he was going to be one of the top draft picks, and they found out like 2 days before the NBA draft that he had Marfan syndrome, so nobody drafted him. But it is a real thing. All right, let's see, embryonic connective tissues. So mesenchyme, again, because it has stem cells, is considered embryonic. So for the most part, you don't see it in adults. And you also have mucous connective tissue. You'll see that in the embryo as well. Okay. All right, so one of the categories in connective tissue proper is loose connective tissue. One of those is areolar tissue. So it fills spaces, it's packing material, stores lipids, okay? Supports blood vessels and nerves. You also have adipose tissue, which is another loose connective tissue. Serves as padding, cushion, insulation. Special type of fats, brown fat. You see it in infants and young kids, baby fat. Shoulder blades, between the shoulder blades, around the neck. Provides heat until the infant can make their own or regulate their own temperature. Okay. Medical application, surgical removal of adipose tissue is liposuction. Okay, let's talk about dense connective tissue. It can be dense regular or dense irregular. Okay, lots of collagen. Either way, but for the dense regular, the collagen fibers are parallel to each other. Whereas in dense irregular connective tissue, there's not a consistent pattern for the collagen fibers. Your tendons and ligaments have dense regular connective tissue. You may also see an aponeurosis, which is basically a flat expansion of the tendon. You can also see elastic tissue. Has lots of that elastin in it, or elastic fibers. So it allows for expansion and contraction or stretching. You'll see a lot in the transitional epithelium or underneath it. This is AMP1. Okay. No problem. All right. Hey, if you want to come into anatomy, more power to you. All right. So Blood and lymph. Let's talk about fluid connective tissues. Blood has formed elements in it, your blood cells and other fragments. That would include the erythrocytes, or red blood cells. Erythros for red, cytes cell. White blood cells, glucose for white blood, cytes for cell. Okay, red blood cells transport oxygen. White blood cells are involved in immunity and disease protection. All right, the platelets. These are packets of cytoplasm. They're helpful with blood clotting. So in your extracellular fluid in your body, 3 main subdivisions. You got your plasma, your interstitial fluid, your lymph. Plasma is your fluid portion of your blood. Lots of suspended proteins in it. A little bit about your arteries and veins. Arteries take blood away from your heart. Veins bring blood back to the heart. Your capillaries are sort of in between your arteries and veins. And basically there you have water and solutes that go into the interstitial fluid of the tissues. And it's where exchange happens at the capillaries. All right, so the lymph, it forms as the interstitial fluid goes into what we call the lymphatics. So these are passageways in your lymphatic system. And the role of those lymphatics is to move that fluid back into your cardiovascular system. So basically you have fluid that leaves through the capillaries, gets in the interstitial fluid. You don't want that fluid to stay there forever. You gotta have a way to bring it back in the cardiovascular system. That's what your lymphatic system's for. All right, supporting connective tissues. Cartilage and bone. So let's start with cartilage. Cells in cartilage are chondrocytes. Chondro means cartilage. They live in these pockets, what we call lacunae. Different kinds of cartilage. You have the hyaline cartilage, which you'll see most often. Collagen fibers are packed closely. It's very tough, very flexible. Connections between your ribs, your sternum, and your nose, embryonic skeleton, as well as your trachea. Okay. Elastic cartilage, very resilient, flexible, as the name suggests. It's found in the pinna of your ear, your epiglottis, your auditory tube, and your larynx. So you can move your ear around and it stays the same shape. Your fibrocartilage. Okay, as the name suggests, lots of collagen. It's very resistant to compression. It's a shock absorber. You need this to prevent your bones from touching each other. So if you didn't have fibrocartilage, every time you move, your bones would just hit each other. Okay? You need some padding. All right? So in your knee clinical application, you have hyaline cartilage and fibrocartilage. When you see people on TV, on news, or games, and they tear their areas in their knees, they could be tearing ligaments, but they could also be damaging fibrocartilage pads in their knees. All right, and because they're avascular, it means they have no blood supply, which means it takes them a long time to heal. All right, and we'll get into growth more, and we talk about the skeletal system. But what I do want you to know, there's 2 different kinds of growth. You have interstitial growth and appositional growth. So if you making the cartilage bigger from within, it's interstitial because it's inter. Appositional is when you add new layers on the surface. Okay. So if you think appositional is kind of like applying, like I'm applying new cartilage to it. All right, other type of supporting connective tissue is bone. Okay, so it has a matrix of collagen fibers, calcium salts, right? You know, calcium's good for strong bones. Okay, bones are strong, resistant to shattering. The cell type for cartilage, remember, was the chondrocyte. The cell type for bone is the osteocyte. Remember, osteo means bone. Like people that have maybe their bones are losing their strength have osteoporosis. There's porous bones. And the osteocytes also live in lacunae. Outer layer of the bones called periosteum. Peri for outer. All right, so let's see. I think it's a good place to take a break. You can talk to your partner about characteristics of connective tissue and types of connective tissue. I'd also make sure you talk about the big categories of connective tissue. Okay, let's talk a little bit about membranes. Membranes are basically a barrier or an interface. So your epithelia and your connective tissue come together to make membranes. And they cover and protect other structures in other tissues. 4 types of membranes. You got the mucous membranes, serous membranes, cutaneous membranes, and synovial membranes. So your mucous membranes are going to line cavities, and they communicate with the exterior, which doesn't necessarily mean the outside of the body, but just, you know, the outside of what's going on inside that epithelial tissue. So like the digestive tract or urinary tract, etc. Okay. Have that lamina propria, it's loose connective tissue. Usually going to have simple epithelia involved in absorption or secretions. You also have serous membranes, and they're involved in lining internal cavities. Have mesothelium, also supported by loose connective tissue. So those 3 types. We have the pleura, which lines the lungs. Remember the pleural cavity, right? Peritoneum lines what we call the peritoneal cavity, which is basically also your surface of your enclosed organs. Pericardium lines the heart, right? Remember the pericardial cavity? It lines the pericardial cavity, which covers the heart. And serous membranes form what we call transudate. Okay, I can tell you, you're probably going to see something like this in lab for a quiz or a practical about knowing that serous membranes form transudate. Okay, so that's definitely a word that you need to know. All right, so it's fluid is formed on the surfaces of the serous membrane. All right, some medical terms related. Pleuritis, inflammation in other pleural cavities. Anytime you see itis, it is inflammation. Pericarditis is inflammation of the pericardium. Peritonitis, inflammation of the peritoneum. Okay. So if you know the root words, you know what these terms mean. All right, so for the cutaneous membrane, also known as skin, so it covers the surface of your body. It consists of stratified squamous epithelium. Okay, it's thick, relatively waterproof, usually dry. It also has synovial membranes. All right, you'll see these in synovial joints, like in your knee. All right, so how are synovial membranes different from other epithelia? They have macrophages. No basement membrane, okay, that's different. It has spaces or gaps between cells that are next to each other. And there's exchange of fluid and solute, or dissolved material, between the synovial fluid and the capillaries. Okay, so that's membranes. All right, so who can tell me one of the 4 types of membranes? Somebody, just throw one out. Mucus, okay, what else? What? What'd you say? Well, there's the plasma membrane for the cells, but of the 4 tissue type membranes, so we have mucus, serous, cutaneous, and synovial. Thank you. All right. Connective tissue framework. So they provide strength and stability, help you maintain position of your organs. Provides basically a route to distribute your blood vessels, your nerves, your lymphatics. Term you need to know is fascia. Okay. Now it's a funny sounding word, but or fasciae is plural. It's basically a connective tissue layer wrapping, supports and surrounds your organs. Okay, so there's 3 types. You have the superficial fascia. Remember, that's the upper layer, deep fascia below, and subserous fascia. So your superficial fascia is considered subcutaneous, also known as the hypodermis, underneath the dermis. Separates the skin from underlying tissues. The deep fascia is dense connective tissue. Makes capsules, surrounds your organs. Includes those periosteum, perichondrium, ligaments, and tendons. I learned about those already. You also have subserous fascia. It's between the deep fascia and your serous membranes. Okay, so those are your 3 types of fascia. Okay, we talked about connective tissue, epithelial tissue. Let's talk about muscle tissue. So muscle tissue, its whole point is to contract. Some terms, they're new, but they're really just specializations. So the cytoplasm in a muscle cell is called sarcoplasm. So sarco is a root that has to do with muscle. And the cell membrane is called sarcolemma. So you still, I mean, if you know these things, it's just that they have a specific name in muscle tissue. There's 3 types of muscle tissue: skeletal muscle, cardiac muscle, and smooth muscle. Okay. So what I really want you to know, skeletal muscle tissue is large. They have large cells. The cells have many nuclei in them. There's muscle tissue, skeletal muscle tissue striated, which means you see these lines in the muscle. It's voluntary, so you have conscious control over your skeletal muscle. You get to decide to move your arms and your legs. Another term for a individual muscle cell is a muscle fiber. Cardiac muscle tissue, only in the heart. So blood vessels are not cardiac muscle. Just want you to make sure you know it's only in the heart. Cells in cardiac muscle are called cardiocytes. Cardiac muscle is also striated, but it's involuntary. You don't think to make your heart beat. Cardiac muscle also has intercalated discs. And these are connections between cardiac muscle cells. You see these vertical lines in cardiac muscle. Those are intercalated discs. Cells talk to each other through those. All right. Pacemaker cells basically are specialized cardiac cells that help the cardiac muscle contract. The smooth muscle, not striated. It's involuntary. You don't have to think to make your digestive organs move your food through your body or your blood vessels move blood. 1 nucleus per cell. Okay. So big picture, cardiac muscle and skeletal muscle are striated. Okay? Skeletal muscle, multiple nuclei. Cardiac muscle and smooth muscle are involuntary. Okay, so those are kind of your big picture things you want to make sure you know. Okay. All right, nervous tissue or neural tissue conducts impulses, sends information through your body. Two muscle types, neurons and neuroglia. Okay, 98% of your muscle tissues in your brain, spinal cord. The neurons, the nerve fibers transmit the information, longest cells in your body. The neuroglia, these are supporting cells, so these support the neurons. Okay. And a neuron has some major parts. It has a soma or cell body. So the big round part of the neuron, cell body or soma, has dendrites. They receive, they're branches that receive information. And they have an axon, which carries information. So dendrites receive information, axons carry information. All right. Okay, let's talk a little bit about inflammation and regeneration before we go. Okay, injuries, they happen. Inflammation and regeneration help to restore homeostasis. You did have a question, I believe, on the stages of inflammation, so here we go. So in the first phase, occurs right after the injury. It isolates the injured area where your damaged cells are. You have tissue components and your dangerous microorganisms. So that's where it isolates that area and cleans it up. You have stimuli which produce inflammation and kill the cells. So you stimulate, well, basically you kill the cells, damage the fibers, and injure the tissue, change the chemical composition, triggers that inflammatory response. So what's the response? Increased blood flow, you get swelling, more nutrients, more oxygen, removal of waste products and toxic chemicals. You get phagocytic cells to go and destroy what's there. You feel pain. You also see redness, right? Like another characteristic of inflammation. So when you're a nurse or an occupational therapy assistant, you're probably going to have to notice if someone has inflammation. Okay, so these are important things for you to know. All right, terms you need to know: inflammation, basically resulting from these pathogens. Necrosis means that tissue is degenerated after an injury. Pus is debris, fluid, cells that accumulate. And abscess is accumulation of the pus in an enclosed space. Okay. And I know this is a lot. What I would highly recommend to you is, even though you were in class today, go back and watch the video, stop it, start it, quiz yourself, then move on to the next section. Okay? So I don't expect that you have it all memorized after listening to it one time. All right, regeneration. It's your second phase. So it's restoring normal function. Your fibroblasts are going to produce a scar. Your cell population will gradually increase. Different organs have different abilities to regenerate. How does tissue repair affect with age? As you get older, your repair and maintenance is less efficient. How is aging related to cancer? Incidence of cancer generally increases with age. Usually has something to do with exposure to chemicals or other environmental factors. Okay. So I know that was a fast run through chapter 4. We really need to get into chapter 5 next week. But again, we'll be covering chapter 4 in a lot more detail in lab over this week and next week. So we're at 10:33. You got a couple of minutes to do your exit tickets. I'm going to go ahead and bring you by area to clean, or materials to clean your table and chairs.